The fog hangs low over the Ardennes road like breath from a tired beast. It is just before dawn, the hour when decisions feel heavier because the world has not yet decided what kind of day it will be. A column of German vehicles waits at the edge of a captured American fuel point, the drums stacked in neat pyramids, the stenciled letters bright even in the gloom, 80 over 100 octane. Lamps are blacked out. Engines tick as they cool. Men in greatcoats move like shadows. Somewhere in the trees a bird starts and stops as if it too knows silence is part of the plan. A field officer, older than his men, calm in a way that unsettles, raises a hand and the crew chiefs break into motion. The sound of siphons and clanking metal replaces the forest's hush. It looks for once like fortune favors the bold. But this is where the story divides. From one angle, the picture is obvious. Fuel is power. Fuel is movement. Fuel is the thin wire that connects a plan on paper to an outcome in the world. If you can't move, you can't fight. And if you can't fight, you can only lose on a delay. From another angle, the less glamorous, more decisive angle, fuel is not the liquid in a drum, but the living river that keeps arriving. It is not a trophy, it is a bloodstream. Holding a heartbeat in your hands tells you something about life, yes, but it tells you nothing about tomorrow's pulse. The officer steps close to a drum and runs his fingers along the paint. It is good fuel, the high-octane kind meant to make Allied engines sing at altitude, and Allied trucks pull long hills like plough horses. He hears the soft gurgle as the first tanks begin to fill. The men around him are grinning with relief, not the joy of winning a battle, but the release of tension that comes when you realize you will not be stranded. They have been promised a breakthrough that runs on gasoline the way a body runs on sugar, and now here it is, captured with speed and nerve. American sugar. What he cannot escape, though he does not yet admit it to himself, is that the capture is a photograph, and the war is a film. The fuel in these drums will spin the odometers for a little while. It will stretch the road behind them by a handful of miles. But the reality of power in this war lives behind this moment, behind every hedgerow and river crossing, behind the map lines where logistics officers mark a simple but lethal equation. What can you produce? How quickly can you move it? And how much of it arrives at the exact place where it is needed? The officer knows enough to instruct his quartermasters to work fast, to keep headlights dark, to be gone before the Allied fighter bombers wake. He is good at the work of seizing opportunity. He is just now learning that seizing opportunity is not the same as seizing advantage. This is the difference between a tactical gain and strategic throughput. A tactical gain is the handful of minutes when you hold more than the other side and can leverage surprise. A tactical gain tastes like adrenaline and looks like captured drums, abandoned trucks and stacks of jerrycans that weren't yours the night before. Strategic throughput is quieter. It tastes like paperwork and smells like engine oil. It looks like rails repaired faster than bombs can fall, like pipelines pushed over rivers overnight, like a schedule pinned to a depot wall that doesn't care who raided last night because the morning train still runs. Tactical gain is a photograph. Throughput is the film. The officer in the fog has his photograph. The other side owns the reel. For weeks, whispers have carried through the ranks about pipeline sections hammered together behind the lines, about fuel depots that multiply if you hit one, about an angry swarm of trucks that the Americans run day and night with drivers who nap under the chassis and set off again at the blow of a whistle. He has heard the phrase, rolling warehouse, and scoffed at it because, in his experience, a Bages warehouse is a building with a floor and a roof and a guard who can be shot. A rolling warehouse is a thought experiment, and he has no patience for poetry. Yet the rumour lingers because it explains things his maps do not. When he looks at the enemy's front, he sees not just divisions and corps, but a long green rope of supply tied to a distant anchor, and the rope, maddeningly, does not fray even when you cut it. He watches the men line up the vehicles by need, the reconnaissance cars first, the assault guns next, the half-tracks after that, the ammunition lorries last. He can recite the rule by heart. Mobility for the point of the spear must be purchased first. He also knows, though the thought pricks him like a thorn, that mobility without replacements is theatre. Tires wear, engines lose compression, crews get cold and clumsy, fuel makes motion. It does not make capacity. The colonel can buy an hour with the drums, perhaps a day if the roads stay clear and no bridge blows. What he cannot buy is time itself, because time now belongs to the side that refills faster than the other can empty. And so he stands at the edge of the dump and lets the fog swaddle him while he performs a calculation he will not admit out loud. He estimates the number of drums in sight, the rate at which his pumps can empty them, the distance to the next planned objective, the likelihood that the enemy will shift reserves to block the exits. He accounts for the fact that every mile driven is a mile that must be driven again in reverse if the plan abruptly fails, and every mile driven eats the very fuel that enables the mile after that. He tells himself that this is the price of audacity. What he does not tell himself, but knows, is that his adversaries have arranged the war so that audacity lands against a cushion of numbers so large they feel like weather. To understand what seizing fuel really means, you have to follow that cushion of numbers. You have to watch tank, cars, snake, across the countryside after midnight. You have to stand beside depots that are organized like puzzles, with lanes and bays and stencils so clear that a half-asleep driver can unload in the right place and be back on the road before the coffee cools. You have to look up and see that the air itself is part of the accounting, planes that burn more in an hour than a platoon does in a day, planes that do not apologize for it because they make highways out of ruined rail lines and erase bridges with a precision that rewrites the day's math. To seize fuel, in that world, is to seize a bucket from a river. He is not ignorant or uneducated. He is experienced and practical. He has lived through seasons when the war still seemed like the kind of contest one side could snatch in a single blow. He has also lived through the slow exhaustion that followed, the way a machine grinds down, not at the pistons but at the bearings. As he watches the last of the empty vehicles pull forward, he understands that the best he can accomplish this morning is to delay that grinding for his own men by a few hours. He intends to do it well. He will leave nothing behind that can be carried, and he will burn what cannot be used. He will count every filled tank as an extra kilometre of possibility, but he will not mistake the feeling of being full for the condition of being supplied. The engines start, one by one, muffled and respectful. The haze lifts a finger's breadth. The men climb in and pull their collars tight against the cold. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a road bends toward a town that has been circled in pencil. And beyond that town, another road bends toward another pencil circle. And beyond those circles, there is a set of rails and a string of tank cars and a pipeline that was not here yesterday and will be longer tomorrow. He has seized his moment. He has not seized the war. The difference, like the fog, is all around him whether he wants to feel it or not. He climbs into his command car and gives the signal. The column rolls, patient and heavy, a snake that believes it has swallowed enough to grow. The drums stand behind them as mute witnesses to a truth that is easy to ignore and impossible to defeat. The liquid inside matters, but the flow matters more. The story that begins with a captured dump will end, as all such stories must, with a reckoning between a photograph and a film. He does not know it yet, but he will understand it soon, when the cameras in the sky begin to buzz and the road ahead narrows into arithmetic. For now, he rides forward under the last crease of night, convinced that a full tank is a victory. It is a victory. It is also a sentence that the day will finish. By midday, he will discover that the sentence has a comma, not a period. The comma is the next delivery his enemy makes somewhere behind a hill he cannot see, scheduled and measured and repeated until the calendar, not the map, becomes the real front line. He has taken what he could hold in his hands. What he cannot hold defeats him slowly, and then all at once. That is what seizing fuel really means. It means learning, too late, that supply is not a place. It is a pulse. The road that leads to those drums was not paved in a week. It began months earlier, under a different sky, when factories a continent away recalibrated their purpose from making things to making the capacity to make things. In spring, the pressure on the enemy's oil fields sharpened until it felt like a claw. Entire operations were designed to squeeze fewer gallons out of cracked infrastructure, to turn refining into a continuous emergency. Rail lines that fed those refineries became targets not just because they were rails, but because they were the capillaries of a larger system. Bridges were not merely structures, they were valves. To understand why a single morning in the Ardennes looks the way it does, you must understand why May looks the way it did, and why September reshaped the map like a tide. In May, missions that once focused on factories began to linger over marshalling yards and choke points. The point was not drama, the point was attrition. An empire that had learned to turn coal into gasoline through chemistry was forced to learn how exposed chemistry is to weather made of steel and fire. The methodical destruction of capacity became a background hum. Not every raid succeeded, but enough of them did to move the numbers, the invisible battlefield that lives in ledgers and manifests. The colonel who now orders his men to siphon American fuel had read the reports about this campaign. He had clipped a map to the wall and drawn circles around places with names half his men could not pronounce, and he told himself that if the front could move fast enough, the circles would matter less. Speed, he believed, could outrun scarcity. By September, the world behind the Allied lines had reorganized itself into something that is hard to dramatize and easy to underestimate. Depots blossomed in old rail yards and on the edges of towns newly captured. Pipelines crossed rivers like temporary bridges that drank. The phrase temporary misleads. The structures were temporary only in the sense that winter is temporary. It comes, it dominates, and it leaves when it is finished with you. Trucks ran in convoys that blurred day and night into a single grey ribbon. Drivers learned to sleep in 20-minute shards, learned the exact height of the pallet that would catch the sun at noon, learned the flavour of dust kicked up by the wheels of the truck ahead. The system moved because it had no ego. Minutes mattered, but names did not. A load routed wrong did not become a scandal, it became a number to improve tomorrow. Sometime in early autumn, a memo crossed a desk, noting that forward depots were multiplying to keep pace with ambitions that reached for the far bank of the Rhine. The note was sober, almost dull, but in its dullness it carried a quiet threat to anyone who imagined that capturing a cache could starve the machine. A system that learns is hard to starve, because it reduces every setback to a lesson and every lesson to a revised schedule. When depots burned, new depots learned to keep their distance from railheads, or to mask themselves among civilian structures, or to accept that dispersion is a kind of armor. When a convoy route drew too much attention, the schedule shifted by an hour, and suddenly the shadows fell differently, and the enemy's traps shut on emptiness. This is the thread that binds May to September, and September to December, a choreography of supply that grows more graceful as it grows more massive. On the German side, the choreography tightened around fewer steps. Synthetic plants could be repaired, but never fast enough to outrun the loss of skilled workers and catalysts, the shortage of rail cars to carry feedstock, the thinning stock of spare parts. Every plan that began with, "once the fuel is in place," found its verbs bending to the wrong tense. By late autumn, leadership had to treat gasoline not as a given, but as the prize every other prize depended on. That kind of arithmetic makes people brave and makes them reckless in unequal measure. The colonel understood the push for a winter offensive, not as madness but as the last kind of logic left. Surprise was a resource too. Terrain was a resource. Weather, especially weather, could be a friend if engines on the other side grew cold and if pilots stayed on the ground. Fuel captured in the first hours could be multiplied by hours of cloud. That was the hope. That time could be bought in two currencies at once, gallons and fog. The doctrine was sensible as far as it went. The trouble was that doctrine written with a fountain pen can only borrow against doctrine written with a typewriter many months before. Calendars beat maps. The pace of Allied supply, the simple fact that production did not sleep, meant that even under a lid of clouds, the stock behind their lines kept swelling like a quiet sea. Surprise wins you a fork in the river. Volume determines which branch floods. And so we arrive in December. The date is not a secret, nor is the terrain. The roads are bad in wet weather, worse in frost, and worst of all when tanks chew them into ruts that trap their own supply vehicles. The plan anticipates this. It always did. But a plan that anticipates friction is still bound to the fuel that converts anticipation into motion. The Colonel's division has fought long enough to know how quickly optimism drains from a gauge. It has fought long enough to know that what the enemy seems to have in abundance is not courage, both sides have that, but patience with details. Patience that builds new habits behind the lines and lets habits do the work of heroism. The raid on the fuel point did not happen in a vacuum. It happened because reconnaissance had watched for patterns and found them. It happened because a depot closer to the front is, by definition, within reach of someone willing to bleed for it. It happened because soldiers are human and fatigue builds mistakes into every routine the way gravel creeps into every boot. The Colonel took advantage of that, and he did it with skill. He has every right to feel that the day has confirmed his faith in his men. What he does not yet admit is that in the time it took to load those drums, an entire train of tank cars somewhere to the west was unloaded, and another was queued, and the pipeline creeped another kilometre forward, and a dozen small decisions by anonymous clerks prevented waste that would have cost him the same volume he just won. The war had moved, invisibly, from a contest of striking power to a contest of staying power. The former can be staged, the latter must be sustained. May taught the lesson by hammering capacity at its source. September taught the lesson by inventing new ways to deliver. December would teach it by tweet, forcing anyone who tried to live off captured odds and ends to confront the iron rule that a stream beats a pond because a stream does not care if a shoe dips into it. It keeps going. It is not insulted. It reforms around the intrusion and runs on. Under the grey ceiling of a winter sky, the Colonel watches his vehicles inch back onto the road in order of priority, each one a small victory. If you add them together, they look like momentum. But that is the danger of summing moments. You build a tower out of minutes and forget that the enemy has built a foundation out of months. The path here was written in long lines through May, in long nights through September, in long lists through the autumn. It is written now in a different kind of line. The line of trucks behind Allied lines that replaces what was lost before anyone on the front notices that it was missing. What brought us here is not a single decision but a way of deciding. It is the habit of treating fuel as a river, not a cache. It is the humility to let systems do what glory cannot. It is the recognition that a day's victory belongs to whoever has arranged to make tomorrow ordinary. That arrangement has been made, and it did not stop being made when the Colonel's men climbed that fence and pried open those drums. The moment is real. Its roots are not. They belong to a deeper season, to a year that already chose who could sprint and who could only surge. The morning's spoils glitter in the frost. The day's logic is colder still. The first thing that happens after the first tank is full is a small, embarrassing problem. The driver, eager to roll out, cannot resist blipping the throttle, and the exhaust pops like a hand clap in a church. Heads whip around, the sergeant barks, the driver flushes. Silence returns. The moment is trivial in itself, but it hints at the larger truth of the morning. Energy begets impatience. Success tempts speed. Speed invites error. The Colonel marks the incident without a plate word, because he is not here to scold. He is here to turn liquid into motion, and motion into position, and position into pressure. If the map bends where he wants, the day will be judged worth the risk. If it does not, the day will be judged a lesson purchased with gasoline, his, the enemy's, or both. He walks the length of the line while the last vehicles fill. He knows what the numbers must look like even if he refuses to write them down. He estimates the total captured volume from the visible stacks and the rate at which his pumps have emptied them. He runs his finger along a column of imagined figures. Vehicle types, tank capacities, the distance to the planned rally point, the expected resistance at the next choke. He remembers a winter from years ago when he ran field exercises in snow so deep it muted the world. and he calculated then how far a tank could crawl on fumes with a crew willing to push at the worst moments. War demands those memories. It demands men who can be calculators and wolves in the same hour. When the column moves, it does not spring so much as tilt. The first armoured cars nose out like dogs testing the air. The half-tracks follow, their tracks making a low rip at the road's frozen crust. The assault guns settle in with a noise that could be a purr if purrs were made of iron. The feeling inside each vehicle is the same. Relief first, ambition second. You cannot align a day for audacity if you are thinking about the gauge. With the needle no longer nagging, every man indulges the belief that his machine and his will are locked into a single unit that will not be denied. The colonel rides with the signals officer for the first mile, and then, satisfied that the column is finding its rhythm, transfers to the point vehicle. He does this because he wants to feel the friction where the day will hinge. He wants to see the bridge he has been told is intact with his own eyes. He wants to decide in the instant whether a risk is a brave cut or a foolish one. But even as he seeks that clarity, he is forcing himself to keep the abstraction of numbers alive. Every curve taken too cautiously burns opportunity. Every curve taken too hot risks losing not just a minute, but a machine and its crew. He opts for the discipline of the middle. It is not glamorous. It is what keeps an offensive from dissolving into noise. The first constraint appears not in steel but in wood. A small bridge over a brook is posted for a weight that would be a joke in summer. Today, with the frost holding the ground hard and sediment locked in place, the engineer officer swears it will hold if they keep the spacing wide and the speed constant. The colonel signals the change and watches his line obey. If one vehicle bogs or hesitates, the rhythm will die, and with it the chance to cross before anyone listens closely enough to hear the music. The crossing works, but the cost is 3 minutes and a sliver of luck. He notes both and spends neither in his mind, because to dwell on either is to second-guess momentum. They reach the first chosen junction and find it empty in a way that makes his skin itch. Emptiness is rarely clean in war. It usually hides residue, a tripwire, a delayed shell, a decision made elsewhere that will visit you later. He orders the scouts ahead and uses the pause to do the quiet arithmetic his position requires. The consumed fuel since the dump, the expected consumption to the next bend, the reserve they must keep if they are forced to detour, the reserve they must keep if they break through and need to exploit. He subtracts and subtracts again, because every subtraction is a rehearsal for a truth he does not want to stage. When resistance arrives, it is in the form of a platoon that fires and retreats on cue, slowing the column with the most expensive tactic there is, the cheap delay. Rounds crack the air, a radiator hisses, a crewman screams and then shouts that he's fine, just deaf. The skirmish costs 6 minutes, and a handful of shells, and more invisibly, a percentage of the day's nerve. The colonel refuses to let the nerve drain into anger. It must drain into discipline. He pivots a gun, stamps his will onto the next 100 meters of road, and in doing so he preserves the only thing that matters now, the math of arrival. This is where tactics and arithmetic become the same language. The colonel's excellence is not that he fights well, though he does. It is that he thinks like a quartermaster while acting like a hunter. He measures the day in ratios. The captured fuel sits in the denominator. The miles and minutes sit in the numerator. Every time the numerator outruns the denominator, he wins a sliver of possibility. Every time the denominator holds steady while the numerator bloats, he is paying interest to an enemy he cannot see. He knows this. He hates it. He refuses to let it add weight to his hands. They crest a hill and see at last the road unroll into a valley where the next objective hazes in the cold. It is not far, no distance is far when your tank is full, but it is downhill and then uphill, and the uphill is what burns. The radio cracks with a report from the rear. One truck has coughed to a halt. Water in the fuel? Ice in the lines? It does not matter. The colonel will not turn the column into a snake that eats its tail. He orders a tow if it can be done at speed and abandonment if not. The men obey, not because they are cruel to machines, but because they are fervent toward outcomes. A war that has run this long teaches you to save the gears that matter. What he cannot hear is the conversation happening far behind the front, in an office where a logistics officer studies a different map. On that map, the depot that was raided is already marked in blue as a resolved event. The note beside it reads like an accountant's sigh. Redistribution in progress. The trucks that would have visited the lost point are retasked to a neighbor. The pipeline crew has already been told to accelerate a section that matters more. No one curses the loss. No one toasts a plan. The people who keep the river moving are allergic to drama. The colonel's excellence is narrative. Theirs is habit. By midday, the captured fuel has turned into what it was always going to be. Miles, heat, noise, motion, and the steady creep of consumption that accompanies all four. The colonel still has ambition to spend. He spends it by choosing a route that is longer but safer for his most precious vehicles, by keeping his infantry from riding too long on decks that expose them to a surprise they do not need to meet, by refusing to allow triumph to hoard his attention. He has room for one more bold decision. He will hold it like a match in a wind, sheltering it until the one crossroad appears, where a flame will do more than look beautiful. The math narrows around him like a canyon. The only light within it comes from the decision he has not yet made. The day ends later than he likes, with the column tucked into dark lanes under pine. Engines click as they cool, once again. Sentries settle beneath coats that crackle with frost. Somewhere, a man prays. Somewhere else, a man counts. The colonel stands with his back to a tree and opens a notebook he swore he would not open. He writes the numbers he already knows. Fuel left in the forward elements, distance to the next objective, the estimate of enemy reaction after dusk. He adds them and divides them, and then, because he is human, he closes his eyes to see if decision looks different in the dark. It does not. The grab has been made. The day has answered. Tomorrow will ask a different question, and he suspects that its answer will come not from the clever routes and brave crossings, but from somewhere he cannot touch with a command, the place where trains unload in the night and the river never stops. He tucks the notebook away and lies down on hard ground that has learned every man's weight this winter. He is not defeated. He is not naive. He is simply in a contest with a kind of power that does not break when struck because it was not built to stand in one place and be struck. The math will return in the morning. It always does. He will meet it with courage. He will also meet it with an emptying denominator. Dawn sketches a pale line behind the trees, and with it comes the familiar temptation to believe that what you hold is what you own. The colonel inspects the vehicles before they roll and feels the product of yesterday's daring still sloshing in the tanks. It is proof, in a literal tactile sense, that boldness has substance. You can weigh it, you can smell it, you can ignite it. This is the treachery of trophies. They sparkle with the glamour of possession and disguise the deeper arithmetic that decides who owns the day. He can count what he took. He cannot count, not without losing heart, what his adversary replaced while he slept. To understand why throughput beats trophies, imagine the shape of the enemy's supply not as a stack of barrels but as a rhythm. The rhythm is dull on purpose. It repeats not because anyone is unimaginative, but because repetition is the only honest way to beat the size of the task. A train's whistle in the dark is not a song, it is a metronome. A loading bay's shouted numbers are not chatter, they are a beat. A column of trucks spaced by minutes, not meters, is not scenery. It is a score that plays the same measure until the map itself learns the tune. The colonel has a room full of captured instruments. The other side has a band that never stops. He moves out at first light and feels the column take its shape again, the nose smelling for what the day has hidden, and the tail praying that the nose does not choose too spicy a meal. He times the halts with a stingy hand. He denies indulgences. He learns the edges of his power by the sound of his driver's breathing when they return from a push. What he cannot hear, because no sound carries that far, is the way a depot supervisor behind the lines moves his finger down a clipboard and marks a box with a pencil. The box means a convoy left on time. The box means new stock where stock was needed. The box means that, somewhere on a road that the colonel will never see, the river thickened a little to cushion a place where last night it thinned. That is throughput. It is boring. It is undefeated. Mid-morning brings the first test of whether yesterday's seizure can do more than extend the map by inches. The column must choose between a shorter route that risks soft ground and a longer route that promises a sturdier surface but passes closer to a known observation point. The colonel chooses the longer route because he cannot afford a recovery operation that burns enough fuel to make yesterday's work feel like bravado dressing as logistics. The decision costs minutes, everything costs minutes, but it preserves the ratio that matters, fuel remaining relative to distance still to be taken. He feels himself becoming, against his ego's will, the custodian of a ledger. On a ridge, they encounter the sight he dreaded and expected. A cratered road where a bridge once stood. It is a small bridge, not the kind that makes maps famous, but it is large enough to force the question he has been dodging since the raid. If he had not filled yesterday, he could not even ask whether to detour or to attempt an improvised crossing. Because he did fill, he can ask. But the answer is still harsh. The detour will cost time, fuel, and the risk that the enemy is not watching the obvious place because it has already committed to watching the only place that a detour can go. He sends scouts and tells himself that prudence now is aggression later. He is not lying. He is training his pride to prefer endurance to flourish. Behind the ridge, the land dips into a shallow valley where the road bends through stands of trees. Here, the column contracts to pass between it, trunks dark with frost. The men do not speak. The world reduces to breath and clank, and the unpleasant knowledge that a single round from a single gun in a single hidden position can update the day's arithmetic without asking anyone's permission. They pass through, somehow unremarked, and when the trees thin, the colonel allows himself a single private exhale. He will not remember it tonight. He will remember only the way he counted, without looking at his watch, the seconds between the point vehicle and the third vehicle because the spacing is a currency now and he cannot spend it on nerves. At noon, a runner arrives from the rear elements with news that is not news. The captured dump is empty and smoking. The last scraps were either poured into tanks or denied to the world with fire. What this means to the colonel is simple. There is no well to go back to. What it means to his opponent is simpler still. The blank space on the ledger where yesterday's stock used to be has been filled by a transfer from another line. The transfer is not an extraordinary act. It is a form, a wave, a dispatch. Throughput erases the outline of yesterday's theft, not by vengeance but by habit. The colonel knows this in his bones, even if he pretends for his men that what they did has carved out some lasting dent. He will let them keep the feeling. He cannot let himself keep the assumption. Afternoon gives him the one gift he had hoped for, cloud cover thick enough to muffle the sky. It does not silence it. It mutes it, buying him not safety but probability. He presses the pace in small increments, stealing from the reserve he planned to keep for evening. The choice is rational motion under cloud is cheaper than motion under sun, but it is also another lesson whispered by the day. Even weather has become an input in a spreadsheet. There is something humiliating and liberating in that. Humiliating because it makes courage feel like an algorithm. Liberating because it means that work responds to discipline. He has enough pride to resent it and enough sense to obey it. Late afternoon, the cloud thins, and with the thinned light comes the wasp buzz of fighter bombers somewhere far off, searching for columns that do not know how to hide, listening for engines that run too loud for their own good. The colonel orders a short halt. Camouflage nets come out in a choreography that looks like a stage direction because it has been rehearsed until rehearsal became reflex. He walks the line and checks, not because he doubts his sergeants, but because a line touched by its commander behaves better under fear. He spends 5 precious minutes on this and earns 50 minutes of calm from men who know their effort was seen. He cannot prove the exchange rate, but he feels it in the way the column moves when the nets come down and the engines relight. Twilight arrives, and with it the familiar lie that night belongs to the side that wants it more. Night belongs to patience. It belongs to whoever can keep a convoy spaced right without the visual cues of daylight, to whoever can fix a burst line by feel, to whoever can believe that an hour spent creeping is not an hour wasted but an hour invested. The colonel orders a pace that feels like humility and tells himself it is aggression in another dialect. He watches his drivers manage the clutch like violinists and feels, for the first time since the raid, the seditious relief of thinking not about attack but about arrival. He will not admit it to anyone, but the day has taught him what the enemy already lives. The destination is not glory. The destination is position at the moment when the next delivery arrives. If you are there with your tanks full, you can choose. If you are there with your tanks empty, you can only hope. By the time the column nests again in the dark, the captured fuel has been translated into a real change on the map. The front has a new bend. A new set of hilltops is under new eyes. A crossroads that once served one direction now serves another. This is not nothing. It is not the kind of nothing that poets reach for when they say everything is vanity. It matters to the men who now sleep nearer to their hopes and further from the place they woke. It matters to the enemy who must now shuffle units and decide which fire to feed. But the colonel, honest with himself when the men are asleep, sees the trade with a clarity that wakes him from the edges of dreams. He gave a day of nerve to buy a day of distance. His opponent gave a dozen forms and a few 100 miles of driving to buy back the conditions that will grind down that distance tomorrow. Throughput beats trophies not because trophies are meaningless but because trophies are finite. Throughput is repetition, and repetition makes a mockery of brilliance when brilliance has to stop to breathe. The colonel will never stop trying to breathe faster. That is his role and his honor. The world he fights in, the world that runs on gallons counted and minutes logged, has decided that breathing slower for longer wins wars. He will meet that world again in the morning, and again after that, until either his luck runs out or the calendar on someone else's wall turns a page that makes today's map a souvenir. If he is lucky, he will see the logic before the logic sees him. If he is brave, he will keep acting as if the next drum could change the ending, because even men who know the math are allowed to hope for arithmetic to blink. He lies down, listening to engines tick in the cold, and admits at last the sentence he has been revising all day. The fuel in his tanks is his to spend. The flow that replaces it is not his to command. He can seize the former. He can only endure the latter. And yet, for the sake of the men who will rise before dawn and lace their boots in a world arranged by strangers with clipboards, he will behave as if trophies can be strung together into something that looks like a river. He will do it because every mile taken is real to the feet that walk it, and because courage that knows its limits is still courage. The morning will come. The river will run. He will steer into it. Not because he believes it can be dammed, but because motion is the one thing a man can give when the ledger refuses to bend. Night had smothered the road with a lid of cloud, and for a handful of hours it felt as though the heavens had been negotiated into a local truce. The colonel had learned to love that kind of ceiling because it turned aircraft into rumour. At first light, the lid thinned into a gauze, and the rumour regained its edge. Somewhere beyond the grey, engines prowled in patient arcs, pressing their weight upon the day without yet showing their claws. He had always understood that the sky mattered. What the winter would teach him now was that the quality of what burned in those engines mattered even more. The war on the ground crawled forward on whatever fuel could be bullied, scraped or seized. The war in the air sang only when the mixture inside the cylinders matched the ambition of the pilots who risked their breath at altitude. That difference carried down into the snow and mud until it soaked into every decision he made. He had watched fighter bombers carve open roads in the summer, when dust rose behind fleeing trucks like a confession, and he had watched them skip their ordnance in low arcs that seemed almost playful until the blast reached him and stole his balance. Even then, what he had felt was not terror so much as infringement. The sky was a separate problem. The ground belonged to him, or at least to men like him, and the sky had overstepped. But the months since had layered another lesson upon his pride. The aircraft did not merely attack, they interrupted the very idea of planning. The presence of gasoline tuned to sing at high compression and high demand, refined to coax every ounce of thrust from a piston, turned the enemy's pilots into a kind of logistics all their own. They could lift, hunt, and loiter with a freedom that came from chemistry as much as from training. He found himself thinking about this not as a soldier but as a caretaker of ratios. A convoy could be hidden. A depot could be dispersed. A route could be shifted an hour to the left or right, so that shadows fell over trucks, not across them. Yet none of that changed what the enemy could do by filling a wing with fuel that burned evenly under strain, and by feeding engines that did not knock themselves to pieces when throttled hard in a dive. He had no say in these reactions. He could only decide how to behave beneath them. When cloud thickened, he accelerated his day as if a tax had been lifted. When the grey turned thin, he protected his pace the way a miser protects a coin purse in a crowd. The contrast was not cowardice or courage. It was the new grammar of movement. Early in the afternoon, the air overhead cleared enough to show brief knives of sunlight. The first pass came the way a cold hand comes through bathwater. A shock followed by numbness. The ground shuddered 2 fields away as a road took a punishment it had already earned over months of traffic. The colonel felt, not for the first time, that the plains were less like attacks and more like edits. You could draft a route and an ambition down to the minute. The air, when it chose to, would mark it up with a thick pencil and hand it back to you with fewer options and less time. His drivers had learned to freeze under cover as if turned to stone, then to dart like fish between hedgerows without waiting for the order. Their instincts were not romantic. They were shaped by the memory of octane in the morning and octane in the afternoon, and octane again at dusk. A cycle that seemed indifferent to every hardship that winter could throw at engines and men. He thought of the factories that had taught the sky this persistence. There was a time when the word refinery had meant a place, a skyline of stacks and pipes where the earth's thick gifts were argued into usefulness. By late autumn, the word had swelled to include schedules, rail timetables, pipelines snaked across rivers, and tank farms that moved like chess pieces. The fuel that reached those wings was not an accident. It was a promise remade each day. On his side of the front, the promise had become conditional. A train missed or a plant stilled by a raid or a bridge, rendered theoretical by an engineer's perfect demolition, meant a shortfall that had to be rationed into priors and prayers. The men who flew against him did not pray for fuel. They prayed for weather and targets and for courage that would hold when tracers stitched the air near their ribs. When the first rocket streaked down the valley, he had the deeply unprofessional urge to look up at the sky, not in fear but in appraisal. That was good fuel, he thought. Not the kind that sputtered at the edge of its design, not the kind that cajoled pilots into gentler climbs because detonation lurked in the mixture, but the kind that invited them to be rude to gravity and kept the word rude from becoming a headline. He caught himself, ashamed that war had taught him to admire an adversary's chemistry. Then again, the shame had no practical use. It did not thicken the air. It did not make the cloud sag lower when he needed it to. It did not refill a drum. He let it pass and shouted the signals that he could control. An hour later the sky grew bored with that stretch of road and drifted to the next. The column answered by slipping forward in the slow cascade that his sergeants could now perform in their sleep. A vehicle out, a vehicle up, a vehicle tucked, a vehicle watching the angle of its own shadow to judge if it had become too long a target. They did not speak about what echoed above the timberline. There was nothing left to say. The connection between refined fuel and pressure on the ground had become a law, like frost or hunger. You could only arrange your day around it. The colonel hated laws that did not answer to rank. He obeyed them anyway because disobedience looked like fire and noise, and then silence. He remembered a story an aide had told him about a distant research station where men in white coats argued about detonation curves and how to keep a piston from turning a song into static at the peak of a climb. He had laughed at the time and called it a tale for magazines that wanted to pretend the war could be explained with diagrams. Now he forced himself to hold the memory still. It was not a matter of dignity or morale. It was a matter of priority. If elegance in a test cell made the sky spend its strength more efficiently, then the road would always be the second place where the day was decided. Better fuels fed better choices at altitudes where he could not throw a single order. That was not an insult to his command. It was a statement about where power had learned to live. Near sundown, he gathered his officers and traced with his finger the route for morning. He could not guarantee cloud. He could only guarantee the discipline to act as if the lid would lift at the hour that hurt most. The air had taught him to victual nerve the way he victualled engines, with reserves held back from the ego, with a throttle that waited to be opened until a promising stretch of shadow offered to guide it. He dismissed the men and stood alone by the road as frost began to crisp in the grass. For a moment the sky looked tender in the winter light, a dome that belonged more to the season than to any army. The feeling lasted as long as a breath. Then a shape far to the west caught the sun and flashed once like a signet ring. He nodded, not in greeting or surrender, but in acknowledgement of a link in the chain that had tightened around his world. What flew held the day, because what fed it never tired. He did not have to like the truth to live under it. He only had to plan in its shadow and move when its attention lay elsewhere. That was survival. Victory would have required a river in the sky, and he did not own a single cloud. He returned to his map, to his rations of courage, to his men's tired jokes. He was a ground officer, in a war that had learned to breathe from above. He slept with that knowledge like a stone in his pocket. In the morning, when engines coughed and then settled into their low grumble, he would pretend for 30 precious minutes that the world was two-dimensional and could be solved by clever routes and good timing. He would use those minutes well. And when the air remembered them, he would bow his head to the chemistry he could not command and keep his column threaded between the hedges, as if he were pulling a string through a coat that had been tailored by his enemy's refiners. Paper can look like weakness until you have seen it work. The colonel had spent most of the war disliking desks for the simple reason that they were often where good ideas went to die under the weight of forms. He had also spent enough time commanding to know that a system without paper turns into a system of improvisations. And improvisations are brave until the weather changes. He woke on a morning when the frost sounded like broken glass under boots, and thought about men he would never meet who scraped pens across lines and turned barrels into decisions. The more he understood his own shortage, the more he felt the shape of an invisible government that ruled his days without ever saluting him. He walked the bivouac with his adjutant and asked questions that made the younger man blink. How many kilometers had each company actually driven in the last 24 hours? Not the intended distance, but the rolled-out truth. Which engines were drinking more than their share and why? Where the grease had thickened from cold, and where it had been spared by the tiny miracles of a mechanic's attention. He asked not to scold, but to see the ledger that nature kept. When the answers came back in notes, in gestures, in a shrug here and a firm number there, he felt the absence that defined him as keenly as cold defines breath. Somewhere else, in a ministry that had turned scarcity into a discipline, men were deciding who might move and who might not. He could choose his route and his pace. He could not choose his ration. On the other side of the front, rationing had teeth too, but they were aligned in a jaw that closed evenly. Requests travelled up a braid of command that did not need to flatter or cajole. The volume behind it gave every denial a context that made sense even when it stung. The colonel had spent enough time around headquarters to know how his world differed. Priority could be a favour or a punishment made to look like mercy. The arguments in conference rooms sounded elegant because they were divorced from road grit. Meanwhile, a plant waited on a valve, a refinery waited on a rail car, a division waited on a train that strained to cross a river, whose bridge had been rebuilt quickly but not quite square, so the conductor eased back on the throttle and lost a minute that multiplied into hours because every schedule downstream had been written in pencil that afternoon. He found the phrase that matched his resentment and then strangled it before it could learn to speak aloud. What good would it do to hate a desk if the desk was, in fact, one of the few places left that could make the day coherent? He had seen excellent officers ruin themselves by turning contempt into policy, withdrawing from the realities of allocation, because it felt more honorable to pretend that supply arrived on the back of courage alone. He would not join them in their romance. He would pay attention to the forms, because the forms were the riverbed. He remembered the ministry names that had, in older seasons, promised to transform shortages into triumphs by renaming them, and he knew what that vocabulary had purchased: a few good months, a prideful tone, a habit of describing reality as if it were an option. Pride had been cheap in those days. Now pride had to be budgeted like gasoline. At noon, a courier reached him with a packet from Core. The contents were dry enough to sand a table. Allocations for the next 2 weeks if the lines held and the rails stayed open. Contingencies if they did not. Modified tables for fuel weights under temperatures expected to remain unfriendly. He read every line. He read the footnotes twice. He saw, not without anger, the places where a shortage elsewhere meant a silent subtraction from his faint surplus. A factory that had been hit and claimed a miracle recovery now needed an extra train to make promise match output, and that train would crowd his needs down the schedule. It would happen smoothly, cleanly, invisibly, and the road would feel it as a kind of vague resistance in every mile. He thought again of the power of paper, not as a weapon but as a species of gravity that asked no one's permission to exist. When he had finished reading, he called his company commanders and explained the new limits as if they were weather. There was no blame in his voice, and there was no trace of the old ache to dress reality in rhetoric. He told them what they would have, and what they would not. He told them the stretch of road where he would spend his last discretionary reserves if forced, and the objectives he would abandon without argument if the price looked foolish. Their faces were still for a long time, and then they nodded because men will absorb almost any hardship if it is delivered without insult. He dismissed them, and felt, briefly, like a clerk in a uniform, which was not an unhonourable feeling as winter deepened and the war became a contest of calendars. That evening he remembered a rumour from early in the war, a rumour the newspapers had treated like prophecy. A new model of government would make industry turn like a well-trained squad, each sector a platoon, every factory a drill ground. The rumour had become a boast, and the boast a habit, and the habit a tin badge pinned to the jacket of misery. He had sneered at it then because he was young, and victory still felt like a towel that could be wrung harder if the grip were righteous. Now he saw that boasts are receipts written in future tense. If the paper cannot be honoured later, it becomes a confession instead. He closed his eyes and wished, for a moment, for the numb comfort of believing that a single order could alter physics. When he opened them, the world had stubbornly remained the same size. A staff car crawled up with a liaison officer who wanted to charm him into redeploying a company to shore up a neighbour's line. The request came with the mild pressure of a man who believed charm could make arithmetic generous. The colonel listened and then refused with courtesy so clean it felt like ice. He would not bankrupt his route to be gallant on someone else's. That was not selfishness. That was the only way he could honour the men who would wake at 4 and set their faces toward frost and noise. He had begun to measure himself by a different rule in these months. He was no longer the sum of his strokes. He was the integrity of his plan. When the liaison had gone, he warmed his hands around a mug and let his anger leak into the dark where it could not set anyone else on fire. He imagined a room hung with maps and a constellation of pins that, if you squinted, looked like a language. He wished that the language spoke the same words as the road. It did not anymore. The road had a dialect called enough. The room had a dialect called maybe. Men in that room were not his enemies. They were the keepers of a ledger whose entries had been turning red for too long. He respected their attempt to write black ink over failing pages. Respect did not make the truck climb a hill without liquor in the tank. He slept badly and woke before his sentry did. He walked past the first line of trees and looked east at a sky that had not decided whether it wanted to lie. When the sun arrived, it arrived weakly, and the men rose into its thin glow with the patient speed of people who had run out of swift options. He watched them for a long time with a tenderness he had learned to hide, and then he returned to his desk and wrote to Core with the tight, neat hand of a man who has learned the power of not wasting ink. He wrote what he needed and what he could do with what he was likely to receive. He wrote without bravado and without apology. Somewhere far behind him a clerk would file it, and another would add a tick beside a line that would be read in the afternoon meeting that determined tomorrow's trains. He sent the paper into that river, not because he believed it would return as he wished, but because it was the only honest way to steer in a flood. Snow fell like careful ash, choosing where to land. The colonel watched a flake melt on his glove, and thought, absurdly, that logistics had chosen the same spot. It had been selecting places to fail with exquisite taste for months now. Railheads, bridges, and the stretches of road where frost heaved the macadam into thumb-thick ridges. These had become the chessboard squares that decided what could be attempted and what must be surrendered. He had come to believe that strategy was merely the art of knowing which square would collapse first and arriving elsewhere instead. The day's first obstacle was a bridge that existed and did not exist. To the eye, the span was intact and even gallant, its truss bones sharp against the pale, but anyone who drove steel for a living could see the fatigue that spidered through a joint where an old repair had never quite forgiven the original wound. His engineer studied the metal the way a doctor studies a child's fever, and said that the crossing could be done if spaced well, and if every driver forgot the human need to pause and admire the effort halfway across. The colonel rationed out that discipline like medicine. Each vehicle would move when told, and would not flinch for a noise or a memory. The crossing took 12 minutes of time and 8 months of nerve. It is one thing to be brave when bullets visit you honestly. It is another to be brave against a thing that might betray you for no reason at all. Beyond the span, the road rose, then dipped into a cutting where rock shouldered in on both sides. That was where the weather declared its preference. The sun had barely touched the trench all day, and a ribbon of ice lay in the shadow with the malevolent intelligence of a trap. The first half-track slewed, corrected, and carried on with a patience that would have been a virtue in a saint. The second walked itself sideways into the bank and had to be coaxed backward by the breath and gestures of 4 men whose hands remembered a harvest more than they remembered armor. It cost 7 minutes, and the oldest kind of fear, the one that comes from seeing a simple problem steal opportunity through the tiniest aperture. He knew the rail line that ran roughly parallel to his route had suffered a strike the week before. The damage had been photographed, and the photograph had been explained to the men as proof that the enemy bled, too. He believed the proof, but he also believed another truth that photographs cannot convey. The men on the other side of that picture had poured stone and timber and steel and sweat into the hole until the trains whispered across again at a speed that embarrassed vengeance. A bridge can be ruined beyond an afternoon's repair. A marshalling yard can be smudged into wreckage. Yet the act of repair itself is a supply. If the habit has been trained into people to mend before complaint, then the destruction you visited yesterday becomes the slope under your own feet today. He did not envy that habit because envy wastes calories. He did respect it enough to shape his day as if it would be present wherever he wished it would not. A village came next, one of those anonymous knots of houses whose names were known only to postmen and the desperate. The road narrowed into a funnel where a butcher's shop had once extended a cheerful awning, and now extended only the scent of something old. The colonel halted the column, walked the 20 paces to the blackened lintel, and measured with his eye the turn that would have to be made. He did not call for a tape, because time had become the only dimension that mattered. He heard a train somewhere, faint and confident. It might have been a memory, or it might have been a convoy of trucks at the edge of hearing. He felt his jaw tighten at the thought that somewhere the replacement for the fuel he had seized was already en route, counted, scheduled, and absolved. He turned on his heel, raised his hand, and watched a driver thread a heavy vehicle through a space that would have felt tight to a bicycle. The exhaust drew a line across the air, and the men behind it squeezed through in a silence that made the village feel like a chapel. Past the houses, the road forked. The left path cut across a meadow that would turn to soup if the weather took a mind to it around noon. The right path climbed through a copse of beech where thin trunks stood like a choir. The left was shorter. The right was wiser. He was tired of being wise. He took the right anyway and paid for it with another wedge of daylight. He regretted the choice even as he counted the ruts that would have become prisons had he indulged his impatience. The war had trained him to despise gambles that depended on nice weather, the way a sailor despises a captain who trusts a coin tossed to a storm. By mid-afternoon they reached the place, the map marked with a thin blue line and a footnote about load limits written by a careful clerk. The bridge there was not pretty. It had been born in an emergency, and it had never expected to live this long. Planks creaked, with a human complaint as the first vehicle eased on. Men on the banks watched with an intimacy that belongs to sports and disasters. The colonel stood with his hands behind his back and kept his face empty. The crossers did as they had been taught. They glided as if their tracks were made of glass and the world would punish them for haste. When the last vehicle rolled off, he allowed himself to murmur a word that no one heard. He had not praised himself. He had thanked the timber for being braver than it had any right to be. The day's weather had one more opinion to deliver. As the column coiled into a stand of firs to breathe, a wind came thin and biting out of the east, and the temperature fell as if a hand had pressed the glass from above. Fuel thickened. A carburetor shivered and forgot the idea of even mixture. A medic warmed a line with his palms as if it were a wounded bird. Men stamped their feet and did not complain because the cold was not an insult. It was a bill. The colonel paid it with minutes he had not planned to spend. He knew he could earn some back by pushing hard after sunset, but he would not squander the luck he still held by asking his drivers to be graceful on a road that had turned greasy. He called for the slower pace and felt the cost like a weight across the shoulders. When darkness finally fell, it did so with the kindness that sometimes follows a day of petty torments. The air calmed. The cloud deepened. The road took the column as if it had been expecting them all along. He permitted himself the luxury of thinking not about obstacles but about the texture of victory, how it would feel to look behind and see that the distance travelled measured more than the fuel burned. He knew that this kind of victory was not clean. It would be paid back tomorrow by a rail line repaired at the exact hour his men would wake, by a bridge rebuilt where he hoped a gap might slow pursuit, by a convoy scheduled through the night with such patience that the day could not find anything left to punish. He slept with the image of a map that showed arteries, not front lines, and he dreamed that he was a surgeon with nothing to operate on but scar tissue. In the morning he would wake to rails that hummed again, and to planks that did not, yet, fail, and to weather that would pretend to be neutral until it made a small, decisive choice. He would wake ready to admit that his most intimate adversaries were not uniforms at all, but sizes and weights and temperatures and timetables, and the quiet, endless will of men he would never meet who had been trained to repair until they died. The war was a machine whose favourite language was stillness. He would answer it with movement dazzled into carefulness. He would answer it with bridges that consented to bear just one more vehicle before resting. He would answer it with rails that sang a thin note he had learned to hear in his sleep. A man who fights a long war learns to carry stories in his pocket the way a child carries marbles. They are not toys. They are comforts, each with a colour and a shine that make fear feel briefly negotiable. The colonel had gathered his share and more. He had told himself that courage could outrun shortage. He had told himself that a stunning grab could change the temperature of a season. He had told himself that the enemy's abundance must be brittle because abundance often is. He had told himself that there are moments when fuel is destiny and that he was witnessing one. Winter took those marbles one by one and tapped them against the curb of the road until they chipped. He would not have survived if he had not also welcomed corrections. The first correction came dressed like an insult. Capturing a depot felt like a masterstroke, a proof that audacity can be as nourishing as bread. The day that followed taught him to distinguish between calories and metabolism. The fuel he had poured made his division sprint. The enemy's supply made his enemy breathe without effort. He understood then that tomorrow is a better teacher than excitement. It tells you what today's victory was actually worth. His men did not need to hear that lecture. They needed to hear that their courage had purchased something real, and he gave them that truth without sting. Meanwhile, in the room where he kept his calculator, he added and subtracted until the ledger spoke plainly. A trophy is a story with a short half-life. The second correction arrived disguised as a favor. Weather recused the sky for a day and left the roads to whoever could read their surface. He took the gift with a hunger he did not apologize for. He moved under the lid, and he asked his drivers to spend their focus like silver coins. The day glowed in his memory for an hour, and then slid into its price. Cloud lifted, the air returned, the rhythm overhead resumed as if an orchestra had simply turned a page. He absorbed the lesson without bitterness. An indulgence granted by nature does not owe you a sequel. He stopped planning as if grace could be scheduled. The third correction came as a map with too many arrows. He had, in the old style, kept a faith in the possibility of the right thrust at the right place, the maneuver that makes every calculation behind it irrelevant for the span of a stunned week. The winter taught him that even surprise is now an entry in the ledger. It can accrue interest. It can be spent well. It can lose value in an hour if the enemy's ability to reroute proves as stubborn as rumor claimed. He continued to hunt for the place where an unexpected blow would do more than bruise. He stopped pretending that bruises add up to a broken arm if the patient eats well and sleeps and wakes with trucks in the driveway. There remained one story he tried to keep, because men require it to take a step. The story that fuel alone would have turned their fortunes, if only more of it could have been seized, or if only it had been allocated with a clarity that had been argued into silence by other priorities. He held the story up to the light and rotated it until it became honest. Fuel was not a single object. It was a kit. It included drivers who could stay awake without becoming stupid. It included tires and the people to replace them without turning a convoy into a classroom. It included bridges that would please the engineer and weather that would not punish a timetable. It included factories that could not simply exist but could exist under pressure. It included the courage to accept that none of this could be summoned by speeches. Once he accepted the kit, the story altered its shape. It was not a romance anymore. It was a manual. He did not strip his life of myths to make it bleak. He did it to make it useful. If you know that one raid cannot flip a season, you are freed from the self-pity that follows when the season declines to flip. If you know that air power draws its strength from a chain that begins far from your front, you can stop hating the pilots as if they were magicians and start honoring your drivers as if they were kin to the same chain. If you know that every obstacle on a road is a small vote cast by physics, you can vote back with patience instead of rage. Stories that cannot survive these corrections do not deserve to guide a day. He found, in the lull after a long march, that his men had their own fables, whispered in the frozen hour before sleep. Somewhere, they believed, a giant depot waited intact, the mother lode that would feed them like a season of fat cattle after months of gristle. Somewhere, they believed, the enemy would run out of nerve and reveal that abundance had been a pose, the way a wolf will rear up to look taller. Somewhere, they believed, a new engine or a new device or a new anything would arrive like a letter from a relative with money in it. He let them carry these stones in their pockets because he could not give them replacements yet. What he gave them instead was a way to walk with the stones without tripping. He told them, in the words of a man who preferred proofs to poetry, that the enemy's power was not a miracle but an arrangement. Arrangements can be interrupted, they can be confused, they can be delayed. He could not promise that any of this would tilt the year into generosity. He could promise that it would make minutes that those behind the enemy could not schedule. He taught his sergeants to love minutes. He loved them himself until the affection felt like hunger. A minute won at a crossing, a minute preserved by a silent halt under a hedgerow when a pilot searched the wrong field, a minute saved by a driver who chose not to show off on ice. These were not rich trophies. They were coins scraped together toward a bill that refused to go away. He invented small ceremonies to honor them, a nod, a hand on a shoulder, a ration a little heavier in the palm. He had no medals left to pin, and would not have trusted a medal to live up to the faces he saw each morning. But he trusted the minute. When orders came down for a strike that the maps claimed would bite into a seam between two tired enemy formations, he gathered his officers and spoke with a calm that could be mistaken for detachment. He explained the plan as if it were a bridge, with spans and girders. and he showed where he expected stress to accumulate. He told them where he would spend his last reserve of fuel and where he would accept a halt without cursing the heavens for being indifferent. He told them to expect the air at the worst possible hour and to prepare their men to move like ghosts under the single act of mercy the season still offered, which was darkness. He did not pretend that audacity alone could purchase surprise. He asked for discipline sharpened until it cut like the edge of a coin. They set off before dawn. For an hour, he allowed himself the private luxury of believing that a marshal's baton might still be hidden in the day for anyone who could keep both ambition and arithmetic in his fist. He watched his lead vehicles slip between ditches that had memorized every rut and still presented a fresh puzzle. He heard engines that were tuned as perfectly as hands could manage when hands were numb. He felt the column's will and refused to let his own waver. When the first attack from above came at mid-morning, he did not look up. He listened for the report from the rear, on spacing and on damage and on nerves. The report came with more steadiness than he had hoped. He spent one of his minutes on a long exhale and moved the hand that would shift the plan one road to the north where hedges grew taller. Toward evening, when the day had proven ruthless but not catastrophic, he looked at his watch and thought of the ledger he could not see. Somewhere, a convoy he would never meet was unloading under lantern light. Somewhere, a clerk whose boots were clean was filling in boxes with a pencil that did not shake. Somewhere, a bridge that had been broken at dawn had carried its first cautious ton by twilight, and by morning would forget that it had ever been wounded. He could taste the correction the day had made to his stories. None of them had been lies. They had been partial truths told to a man who wanted to carry less weight inside his head. The war did not hate him for that. It simply refused to help. He lay down with his greatcoat pulled high and let the tales he still allowed himself jostle for room. He kept one that said men could still save each other with small acts, that a driver's patience could be the equal of a pilot's daring in the long equation of survival, that a mechanic's stubbornness with a frozen line could do more good in an hour than a speech could do in a week. He let go of the one that promised a single raid could end a season. He let go of the one that said the enemy's flow would stumble all at once and reveal its fraud. He held the remaining stories against his chest as if they were warm. They were not. They were honest, which is a different kind of comfort, one that lasts through a winter and into whatever follows winter for men who have outlived their earlier myths. In the morning he would rise and tell his drivers where to place their wheels, and his gunners where to place their barrels, and his quartermasters where to place their pleas. He would do it without theatre. He would not mention any invisible audience. He would not promise the day a climax. He would promise his men a plan that could survive the corrections the day would make. If there was a story to keep for them all, it was this: that endurance is not a lack of imagination, but the most demanding form of it, a willing act of picturing tomorrow accurately enough that you do not betray it with what you do today. He would walk into that picture with fuel enough for motion and faith enough for patience, and whichever of those ran out first would determine the size of his world. Night pressed the forest into a single dark ridge, but the maps refused to sleep. Runners breathed steam as they came and went. Radios ticked in patient bursts, and the colonel watched pins drift as if tugged by an unseen tide. The other side did not need grand secrets. It needed traffic, patterns, the breadcrumb trail an army leaves when it thinks it is being clever. Patrols found roads suddenly empty, barricades appearing where none had stood, bridges guarded at the only hour that hurt. Listening had widened into a net. Pilots reading tracks from the air, partisans counting axles in the dusk, clerks in warm rooms learning to treat columns of numbers like footprints. The colonel felt that scrutiny like a hand on his shoulder even when the woods were still. He answered by teaching the column to mislead. March tables were jostled just enough to make yesterday's arithmetic untrustworthy. Decoy trucks idled beneath canvas and were left in view to coax a lens into believing the wrong thing. Signals said less, and said it more slowly, and couriers carried orders shorter than a prayer. When Cloud allowed, his own reconnaissance returned with images that looked like weather. A fresh scuff on snow, a roof line longer by 2 planks, the faint comb marks of tires in a field where no road claimed to run. He learned to read these small edits as sentences. The exchange never ended. A road used twice was punished on the third attempt. A depot dispersed at dusk, reassembled by dawn, one valley over. Maps blurred at their edges, not because ink ran, but because the future tugged lines as it pleased. None of this brought triumph. It brought minutes, and minutes vanished like breath in cold air. Each hour saved by silence seemed to cost two the next day, when the reply arrived exactly where he had tried to keep unremarkable. He did not hate the competence across the lines. He learned to live within it, a craftsman of misdirection under a ceiling of attention he could not turn off. He used to say the word refinery as if it described a fortress. Towers, pipes, steam against a grey sky, men in goggles turning black rock into clear fuel by the right sequence of heat and pressure. The first time he saw a synthetic plant after a raid, the illusion went out of him like smoke from a match. The structures could be repaired, and often were. What could not be rebuilt on command was the web around them, the rails with their fitful schedules, the valves that stuck in cold, the catalysts that demanded shipments as carefully timed as a heartbeat. Chemistry had promised to conjure fuel from coal when seas were hostile. Winter revealed that conjuring is only as strong as its calendar. Reports crossed his desk that read like hope written in numbers. Output restored to this percentage, throughput expected to climb next week, diversions minimized by a new routing. He did not scoff. He knew how hard men worked to make those lines true. But hope is costly when trucks are burning their own future to fetch what a graph has not yet delivered. Every litre gained at a plant could lose its nerve on a bridge, in a marshalling yard, at a junction where a single signalman, too cold to be careful, sent a train down the wrong throat and turned a day into an apology. He ran the problem forward, and it ended at the same wall. Synthetic fuel gave the nation a way to fight without seas, yet it demanded a constant, intricate choreography of parts under air that punished error. The enemy did not need to smash every column. It needed to shake the rhythm until hands lost their place. He could borrow strength with a raid, with a seizure, with a night of luck. He could not borrow the ease that comes when supply hums without flinching. The promise that once sounded like victory began to feel like a leash. In the morning, the engines would not agree on what a morning should sound like. One coughed and then corrected. Another caught and then faded. A third found its note and held it as if a single vehicle could make the day noble by example. The colonel walked the line and put his hand on steel as if he could steady it with touch. The seized fuel was down to dregs and rumour. Ahead, the road bent into a valley where his plan required momentum, not dignity. He had one push left in him that could resemble audacity. He chose to spend it on arrival. Men dug gloved hands into frozen mud for leverage, while drivers coaxed heavy tracks onto firmer ground. The column moved in halves, then quarters, then as individual stubbornnesses that refused to name themselves defeat. Orders were fewer now and kinder. He told a crew to leave a truck that had become more prayer than machine. They obeyed with a look he could not bear, because abandoning labour feels like abandoning a friend who tried to carry you. Noon passed without ceremony. The sky thinned. Somewhere, far off, the air found a different target and let them have their quiet. By late afternoon they reached the rise that had to be theirs, or else the last 2 days were merely weather. He put the guns where they could see, laid wire where it would not trip his own men, and wrote the truth in his notebook with a hand that did not shake. We have come as far as fuel can pretend. The stall was not a stop. It was a verdict. Tomorrow would be shaped by someone else's deliveries, and he could add only caution to that shape. Toward evening he walked back to the place where the column had first tasted victory in the mouth of a siphon. He did not do it for poetry. He did it to make sure the lesson was hard enough to be useful. The captured drums had become distance, and that distance had become a better view, and that view showed him something he could not deny. The enemy's strength was not a place to be taken, but a pace to be endured. A depot you can raid, a river you can only respect. He had held a bucket. They owned the current. He rehearsed the day as he would tell it to his men. Nothing they had done was wasted. The grab had carried batteries to where they could matter, had put pressure on a road that had grown complacent, had won a hill that would now cost the other side time. None of that turned the winter. He would say this without bitterness, because bitterness is expensive and buys nothing. He would say that the difference between a photograph and a film is not art but power. They had captured the photograph. The film kept running. He folded his map and pressed the crease with his thumb until it held. Tomorrow's plan was smaller, more patient, and in that discipline he found a kind of loyalty to the truth that war had been forcing into him since the first drum cracked open. Throughput beats trophies. Systems outlast stunts. A seized cache can make a day. A river decides a season. He would move again at dawn, not because he believed the bucket could become the current, but because men deserve a leader who can tell the truth and still point forward.